So yeah, thank you everyone for coming to this planner's briefing for the Parcel-Scale Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment with our speakers Ian Miller and Avery Maverick. Please, Ian, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Sydney, and thank you everybody for taking time out of your day today to join. I'm Ian Miller with Washington Sea Grant. I am a coastal hazard specialist, and nice to meet those of you that I haven't met, at least to the extent that we can meet on Zoom. And Avery, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thanks, Rebecca and Sydney. Yeah, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Avery Maverick. I'm a coastal geologist and geospatial analyst with Natural Systems Design and Coastal Geologic Services. My work ranges from sea level rise assessments, coastal adaptation strategies, shoreline change and coastal processes, as well as restoration feasibility and design. I also work with the shore-friendly programs to provide shore-friendly site visits to coastal homeowners around Puget Sound, which I'm actually going to be doing right after this talk. And I started working on the phase 1 of this project back in 2020, leading the geospatial components. And we learned a lot through that work, and we're hoping to apply those lessons in the phase 2 update. So thanks.
All right, excellent. So basically, our goal today is provide an update on this Parcel-Scale Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment for Puget Sound that both I and Avery have been sort of working on in some way, shape, or form since 2020. I'm going to provide a big picture overview, summary, motivation, and then I'm going to turn it over to Avery, and Avery is going to dive into the details of some of the current analysis that we're doing. We are in the middle of what we're calling phase 2. And then we are going to end with sort of a short what comes next and basically what we're hoping to get from you all in terms of assistance and participation. I also want to draw your attention to all the other names on this slide, which are both members of our project team as well as members of our advisory group that contributed to basically what you're going to see. So next slide, please, Avery. So just geographic orientation, probably not necessary for this group, but the red box that you see on the screen there defines our study area, Puget Sound. And next slide. And this region, like most coastal regions of the world, is experiencing sea level rise. And so what I've got on the screen here is observed and then projected sea level change. This is for Washington. The black is a representation of the observed change. This is derived from tide gauges, and hopefully you can make out the years on the bottom of this goes out to 2050. And then the red sort of colors on this are actually 2022 Interagency Task Force sea level scenarios. And we have an observed pattern of increasing sea level, and then obviously projections suggest that is likely to accelerate in the future. And this project is really designed around this problem of understanding where and what will be impacted first and most by hazards exacerbated by sea level rise. Next slide, please. And as you all are acutely aware of, Puget Sound is a really interesting place to think about this problem because it is a diverse place, right? It's a place where we have both, very dense, heavily populated, and very valuable urban shorelines, as well as high functioning natural shorelines, places that are impacted by coastal hazards historically and currently. And again, sea level rise is likely to exacerbate those problems moving into the future. Next slide. And so what we focus on is this concept of vulnerability associated with sea level rise that can be applied to basically try to prioritize assets and values in Puget Sound that are exposed to those hazards exacerbated by sea level rise. So what you're seeing on the screen is basically our sort of like conceptual model of vulnerability that we are applying to this project. This is derived from sort of climate-related vulnerability concepts that sort of emerged out of largely the IPCC over time. And it basically looks to try to interact exposure which is sort of where sea level rise related hazards are expressing on the landscape and how they're likely to express in the future. And then intersects that with sensitivity, which is this idea of how our assets that we care about or values affected by interaction with those hazards. And then both of those things can be modified by this idea of adaptive capacity, which is potentially a huge suite of capacities or abilities that systems may have to reduce or change either exposure or sensitivity. And those three things coupled together are ideally used to estimate vulnerability. Next slide. And this idea has been widely applied to assessing vulnerabilities at community scales in Puget Sound. The example on the screen is one that I was involved with from the Strait of Juan de Fuca, a study of climate basically impacts across the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And there are at least 20 such assessments, maybe more, based on data compiled and presented on the Washington Coastal Hazards Resilience Network website, using what I'm going to frame as these kind of traditional approaches in which we generate maps like this one. This is of the Dungeness River Delta. And these blue blobs represent areas of potential future inundation under different sea level and storm scenarios. And then we gather people around to sort of consider those maps who understand the landscape well and do that work of identifying assets in the area, their sensitivities, potential adaptive capacities that can be applied to those, and come up with some sort of ranking of vulnerabilities based on that process. Next slide. But over roughly the past 10 years or so, as spatial data sets basically have emerged that are suitable for applications like this, the basically application of those kind of spatial data sets to this problem of sea level rise vulnerability has grown. It's kind of work that I've taken on, as well as others, many of you on this call, for example. And we start to see the emergence of these spatial data-driven approaches for assessing vulnerability. This is an example from that same part of the Dungeness River Delta, in which we sort of try to translate that blue blob using spatial data into something that provides a little bit more nuance. This is a parcel-scale example. This is a pilot that was done in 2017, in which now here we're actually identifying parcels based on this kind of quantitative approach for assessing vulnerability. Next slide, please. And so back in 2019, we proposed a project to the Habitat Strategic Initiative. So that's Puget Sound restoration funding coming from EPA that would try to do a couple of things, basically come up with optimal approaches given available data for a data-driven sea level rise vulnerability assessment. And we wanted to do it at scale, so across all of Puget Sound, in a way that could facilitate both, sort of a regional look at this idea of vulnerability to sea level rise, or provide a foundational tool for jurisdictions or tribes that wanted to use this as a starting point for their own more customized analyses. This project this phase one wrapped up in 2022, so you can find stuff online like this paper, for example. And at the end, I'll provide a QR code for kind of the project website. Next slide. And basically what I wanted to do with the remainder of my time is provide sort of a big picture look for how we sort of translated that conceptual model for sea level rise vulnerability that I showed you, sort of into on the ground, what does exposure mean here? And then I'm going to turn it over to Avery for some detail. So basically, the first thing that we're trying to characterize in an approach like this, again, is this idea of exposure. What are the hazards? How are they expressed on the landscape? And how do we expect they may change? In phase one, we looked at both erosion, exposure to erosion, and exposure to coastal flooding. Again, both of those sort of coupled with different assumptions, basically, to sea level rise. Next slide. And then the other big component is sensitivity, which again is intended to get at what is on the landscape that we value and how it might be influenced by interaction with those hazards. And in the case of this project, we looked at both infrastructure. So in this particular example, we incorporated, for example, building footprints that you can see here, roads, and tried to assess access or disruptions to access into different parts of the landscape, and then also agricultural fields as actually a type of infrastructure. Next slide. And then also, somewhat uniquely, we also wanted to integrate the sensitivity of coastal habitats into this overall sensitivity assessment. And so this was an equally weighted part of our sensitivity approach. And in this case, we used the NOAA marsh migration layers to basically evaluate where and how habitats may be pinched out because of interactions with either armoring or steep landscapes, which we have a lot of in Puget Sound. So next slide. So what we're not and are not able to do in this kind of project is measure or represent really with spatial data this idea of adaptive capacity. This is a very broad set of kind of concepts or measures or things that are really go everywhere from sort of individual characteristics all the way up to sort of, local government, tribe level, state level sort of capacities. But next slide, please. In phase one, we were lucky to work with a team from NOAA's National Centers for Coastal and Ocean Sciences, and NCOS, who worked alongside us to develop this social vulnerability index. This was sort of customized specifically to this idea of supporting sea level rise planning. And this allowed us to generate maps like the one that you see on the screen. And we incorporated this into our analysis as another component of vulnerability to basically generate something that we called socially modified vulnerability. With that kind of broad scale introduction, mostly focused again on what we did in phase one, a lot of which we're planning to draw upon or replicate or build upon for phase two. I'm going to turn it over to Avery, and Avery's going to dive into a lot of the details. So I've been high level, and put your sort of thinking caps on and sort of turn on your brain, because Avery's really going to get into a lot of the details. And this is really the important stuff. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So Avery, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ian. And these are the results on this last slide are some of the results from the phase one work. Okay, so switching gears a bit to talk about phase two of the project, which started fall of last year. One of the main goals of phase two is to improve the geospatial analysis in several different ways. So the first was to expand the project area to the entire Strait of Juan de Fuca. Phase one was limited by the extent of the compiled topobathy DEM from the USGS, which extended to just west of the Dungeness Spit. Since then, the USGS has updated that topobathy to extend all the way out to the open coast. This data set was really key to the first phase because we use that to generate project-specific inundation layers based on a set of projections from the Washington Coastal Resiliency Project in 2018. In phase two, we are instead using what we're calling off-the-shelf sea level rise inundation layers generated by NOAA. This not only helped reduce the amount of computational time on our end, but also allows us to develop and utilize a methodology that can be much more easily updatable if and when new projections are available. So we're also adding more complexity to the exposure assessment by first integrating a third exposure hazard. So that's groundwater flooding, or the presence of shallow groundwater due to sea level rise. And two, better incorporating hydraulic controls from levees and dikes. Lastly, we are seeking to improve our sensitivity assessment by including more information about buildings, as well as infrastructure setback distances. So the table on the right here shows all the existing data planned on being incorporated to the assessment. I should reiterate that this is a parcel scale assessment, and that unlike phase 1 and other large scale analysis like beach strategies, which use the 2012 parcel database, we decided to update that to the 2024 parcel statewide database. And this did end up requiring a good deal of processing, as these type of parcel databases have a lot of changes, oddities, including some counties having roads as parcels, stacked parcels, multi-part parcels, as well as large open water being captured as a parcel. So we also encourage other parcel scale efforts in the future to also update and utilize the 2024 to make it compatible if appropriate. The bottom diagram shows the general framework for the assessment, which Ian went over, with vulnerability being the function of exposure and sensitivity. But as I stated previously, the shallow groundwater and infrastructure sensitivity are going to be added and improved on. So with that, I'm going to dive into the different components of exposure to provide much more detail and then touch on the sensitivity metrics. So the top here shows the overall scoring approach for exposure, which is the function of coastal flooding, shallow groundwater, and erosion. We've weighted flooding and erosion equally, with groundwater being a smaller modifying component. So for coastal flooding, as I mentioned previously, we're utilizing the NOAA inundation layers rather than making new layers for the project. The NOAA sea level rise viewers on the right. And if you weren't aware, this webpage was recently updated to include 1/2 foot increments. However, we're still interested in assessing parcels, the exposure to flooding at specific sea level rise scenarios. So in order to do this, we found the percent of parcels inundated under all sea level rise scenarios from 0 to 10. And then we plotted those inundations versus the sea level rise and inundation elevation, and then interpolated between the points or created a curve. This allows us to pull the percent that the parcels inundated under any chosen sea level rise scenario from 0 to 10. So we ended up choosing to assess parcels under 5 water level conditions, similar to phase 1. So the first being the current conditions during a storm surge event, or 2.9 feet of storm surge. And then the second is 4 sea level rise scenarios under high emission scenario based on that interagency NOAA 2022 projections. That's the Sweet et al. 2022 that Ian mentioned. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Ian can provide a lot more about this, but to better incorporate local vertical land movement, we modified the projections based on spatially varying vertical land movement from the 2018 Washington Coastal Resiliency Project work. So next, we modified the scores based on tidal restriction mapping from Kramer Fish Sciences. So this was done in an effort to capture levees and dikes and other tidal restrictions that inhibit flooding, but may not accurately be accurately represented in the elevation data set that was used to make the inundation layers. And additionally, we want to acknowledge that there's, at least in the near and midterm, these levees will more than likely be maintained in an effort to stop flooding for as long as possible. The tidal restriction data categorizes areas as unrestricted, partially, significantly, or completely restricted. So the map on the right shows an example of the data from the Skagit Delta with the colors representing different amounts of restrictions, and then the red dashed lines being the mapped levees. So based on input from the Kramer Fish Sciences team, we reduced the inundation percent within the complete and significant tidal restriction areas. Specifically, we reduced the inundation percentage for current and 2050 by 75% and 25% for 2100. This acknowledges that levees will be more effective in the near term and midterm, but less effective in long term with higher water levels. Finally, we sum the modified percent inundated for the 5 water level scenarios and then normalize them to a score from 0 to 4. And we're normalizing the scores here to allow us to quantify relative exposure between all of the project parcels. So here are the preliminary results for the Skagit Delta. This shows the differences in scores with and without the tidal restriction modification. The gray hatch lines in inland have a score of 0, so no coastal flooding in any of the water level scenarios. And then the lighter colors having lower coastal flooding scores, and then dark purple having the highest coastal flooding or flood exposure. So we think this represents a realistic shift in flooding exposure due to levees, with parcels waterward levees being most exposed. And it's important to note at this stage, while we're reducing the flooding scores for some of these low-lying parcels, the other components, such as groundwater infrastructure and habitat, will likely contribute to an overall relatively high vulnerability in these delta areas. And then here are two other examples of coastal flooding results for the Bellingham area on the left, and then the Dungeness on the right. As we expect, we see lower lying parcels with higher scores than upland and higher elevation parcels. Okay, so moving on to the groundwater components of the exposure scores, we utilize the new data from USGS, modeling the impacts of sea level rise on groundwater hazards, shown on the right here, to measure the percent of a parcel area inundated with groundwater shallower than 1 meter at each available sea level rise scenario, and those are shown on the upper right, going from 0 to 300 centimeters. We chose to use the moderate permeability results as opposed to high or low for the sound-wide assessment, but we do acknowledge this is a simplification of conditions. Similar to coastal flooding, we then calculated the percent of parcels with shallow groundwater for all the scenarios, interpolated between, and then found the percent that correlates to our specific scenario. We then summed these up and normalized the scores on a scale from 0 to 2. So here we have preliminary results for the shallow groundwater flooding score for lower Elwha on the left and for the Dungeness area on the right. This shows very low-lying parcels as having high scores, but not necessarily a trend in higher scores, always closer to the water. You can see there's some bluff parcels on the edge along Dungeness that don't have as high groundwater scores, even though they're right along the water's edge. And also some more results from the Snohomish Delta, so Marysville area on the left and Skagit Delta on the right. There isn't much variability in these delta areas, but we can assume that groundwater is already very shallow in these settings and will become increasingly an issue with sea level rise. So it makes sense that these all have fairly high scores for groundwater. Okay, so now to the final component of exposure, erosion. Since there's no sound-wide bluff or coastal erosion model currently, we are using a simple method to understand the relative exposure to erosion of parcels, which is a modified approach from beach strategies. This combines two main factors, shore type and wave height. While there are many other factors at play when it comes to erosion, these are recognized as some of the main influences locally. So first, we assigned a shore type value for all coastal parcels. So any parcel that's not directly along the shore gets a score of 0. Parcels with multiple shore types were assigned the shore type value with the highest erosion value. So that's the table shown on the bottom. And these values were determined during the beach strategies. So we see bedrock scores having a value of 0, and then moving on up to the highest scores of feeder bluffs and feeder bluff exceptional. So I have an example here of a parcel that was mapped with both an accretion shore form and feeder bluff. And so we use the feeder bluff erosion value here to be conservative for this specific parcel. Each coastal parcel was then assigned a wave height based on PNNL wave height data, which is available for the entire Salish Sea. It's spatially varying, so we just chose the closest point to that. And then the score is a simple product of the shore type value and the wave height. All right, so the preliminary results are shown here for the Bellingham area on the left and the lower Elwha on the right. It is a bit difficult to discern at this scale, but the results show what we expect in general, that more erosion along shorelines with greater wave energy and are considered more erosive shore types. And then here are the examples for the Dungeness on the left and Skagit on the right. The parcels on the far left of the Dungeness, the darker colors, score very high due to them being feeder bluff exceptional and also exposed to relatively large waves in Puget Sound terms. On the other hand, the Skagit Delta parcels have lower scores as they are along shores considered low energy. So finally, to some of the results, the overall exposure combining flooding, groundwater, and erosion. Here are the preliminary results for Skagit Delta area. We generally see the highest exposure along the delta's edge, but also discrete parcels pop out with high scores in the uplands. And this is likely due to these areas not having tidal restriction or protective levees. So it's great that we were able to include that type of data here. And then for the Bellingham and Lower Elwha area, I'll pause here for you guys to take a look at these. And then also for the Dungeness and Snohomish Delta. So if you're familiar with these areas, I hope that some of these results ring true based on your guys' experience. Let's see. And so now switching gears to the component of vulnerability, the other component, which is sensitivity. So as we did in phase 1, we're defining sensitivity as a function of both infrastructure and habitat sensitivity. So what are the consequences of exposure to sea level rise related hazards? Is there critical infrastructure? Are there ecologically rich areas that will become submerged without room to migrate? So at this point in the project, we're really only beginning to explore some of the new data sets and metrics for incorporation, and we really haven't ironed out all the details for the framework. However, we know we're going to at least use the 3 metrics to assess sensitivity that we did in phase 1. So we're going to look at the exposure of buildings, roads, and agricultural lands to sea level rise inundation. 2 components we are hoping to incorporate to improve our assessment is defining the setback of structures from bluff crests or the shoreline, and incorporate more information about buildings such as type and possibly value. We're looking at using the USGS cliff delineation tool to map bluff crests using the topography of Puget Sound, and then finding the closest setback to building footprints on each parcel. For non-bluff parcels, we may instead use tidal contours to measure setback distances. And we intend for this to be a useful product beyond this project, so I see a lot of different applications for this specific outcome. And, as many of you guys are likely aware, a parcel with a house close to the bluff crest is much more sensitive to erosion than a neighboring house that's further back, even with the same shore type, same wave exposure. So we think it's really important to incorporate those differences in this assessment, this phase 2. For habitat sensitivity, Ian and I, for the last couple of years, have been seeking out other possible data sets or guidance to use to assess how habitats will respond to sea level rise. And to our knowledge, NOAA marsh migration layer is the best thing that we have at our regional scale. So we use this in phase 1, but it has been updated since then to cover more area, and it's also been updated with the 2021 CCAP data, land cover data, updated DEMs, and the VDATM tidal surfaces. So the habitat sensitivity score involves quantifying the change in nearshore habitat within parcels. So for example, if there's a parcel that's mapped as a wetland now and open water in the future, that's going to have a high sensitivity score. We recognize that this isn't a perfect approach, but we are data limited at this point. So in the end, we're going to combine all these components into vulnerability score relative to all project parcels. We have just over 110,000 parcels in the full project area. We will also provide a socially modified vulnerability score, as Ian said, incorporating the NOAA NCOS data on social vulnerability. This includes factors such as income, age, access to services, life satisfaction, and sense of belonging. So this, we hope, will offer some insights for planners to make informed management decisions and support some local activities. The final geodatabase results will be available as a geodatabase as well as through a web page. So I think with that, that is all that I have on phase 2 work. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ian.
All right, thank you. And so we had some minutes set aside, and we're doing great on time for basically clarifying questions about the spatial analysis. And we've got a few in the chat. So I'm going to read those, Avery, and sort of rely on you maybe to address those. I've been trying to sort of address them as I can in the while you were talking. But Jessica Cote asked about incorporation of the wave height and about calculating wave run-up using those wave heights. I indicated that we are not calculating wave run-up, but maybe you can provide a little more detail about what we are using there. And then also Jessica asked about the PNNL wave model results that we're using. And then there was a similar question by Greg Ferguson about what wave height occurrence frequency is used.
Yeah, so I can put a link in the chat for the PNNL model. I believe it's Yang et al. 2019, and it's the 1% significant wave height. So we were provided that data from PNNL during the phase 1 of this. We use the same data for phase 1 as we are for phase 2. So that has points. I forget the exact grid space, but it's fairly fine grid for the entire Salish Sea out to point Flattery out to the end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So that is the wave data that we've been using. I don't know all the details about the PNNL work, but I can definitely share the citation.
Yeah, and worth reiterating that, we were referring to this as a coastal erosion potential. So very different than the sort of coastal flooding modeling in the sense that it is not spatially explicit. And so really we're just trying to identify those shorelines in Puget Sound that we think may be more susceptible to erosion than others. And so the overall approach is the one that was applied to beach strategies, which is link, as Avery described, link shore type with just a single metric extracted from this wave modeling information. It would be lovely and so ideal to have an actual erosion model that we could apply, even given uncertainties in doing that. But of course, we don't have anything like that for Puget Sound.
Right, and I think it's important to state, if you haven't, Ian, that it is a relative assessment. So, we do obviously be great to have wave heights and all these things in there, but if we're just looking at the relative exposure to erosion for these parcels, having at least the wave height and the shore type gives us that relativity.
So any other clarifying questions about the analysis steps? I want to note as well that this is a lot of detail coming at you very quickly. And also, some people were coming in a little bit late, and I know that it's hard to sort of like digest this kind of thing in a webinar setting. So don't feel afraid to ask a question that, maybe was addressed because it all came quickly.
And I see Brooke Sullivan has a question about the marsh migration data, incorporating levees and floodgates.
Oh, yeah.
They used, just the elevation, the topography data. So if the levees were represented in the elevation data set, then they are included, but there's no additional, boundaries of levees or floodgates that I'm aware of in that data.
Yeah, correct. And if you, Brooke, the marsh migration results for most of Puget Sound are available on the NOAA Sea Level Rise viewer. And if you look at those for a place like Skagit County, even if they are accounted for somehow, it's definitely not, it's national modeling, so it's not incredibly accurate. So they did do an update that I don't believe has been pushed out publicly online yet, but should be shortly. It'll still suffer from the same problem, but that's a big reason why we also integrated this new levee and dike sort of tidal restrictions data set that Kramer Fish Sciences did with estuarine and salmon restoration program funding. So that was a really nice data set to be able to pull in to give us a more nuanced look at places in Puget Sound that are protected by levees and dikes. And the flooding response and the marsh migration response are likely to be quite different as a consequence than what's shown in those NOAA models.
And I think Greg asked another question about if we're including other coastal flooding elements like rivers, streams, and local stormwater flooding. And so at this point, we're not including compound flooding in this assessment. I think we're keeping it a little bit more simplified in this case and hoping that the Cosmos data at some point will come out and we can integrate that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Avery. So yeah, correct that we aren't, I guess, explicitly, definitely not explicitly incorporating fluvial flooding. This is designed to be a coastal analysis. But of course, you know, places near river mouths, for example, may be exposed to additional flooding than is suggested by our analysis, and we're not capturing that. And then the local stormwater flooding is an interesting one. It's definitely something that we did not integrate in phase 1. However, you could make an argument, and we're still sort of trying to figure this out, that the groundwater flooding modeling that USGS has made available and that we've incorporated probably represents that source of flooding to a degree. Like those places that we see emergent groundwater in that model, for example, are probably places also where, you know, water tends to pool during heavy rainfall events. So we're probably capturing it in some way by incorporating that data set. Avery also brought up Cosmos, you know, one of the things which also led me to be reminded that I don't think we sort of stated our criteria for data incorporation. So in this project, we are basically incorporating data sets that are public. So they have to be something that any of you all could go and access without having to pay money or anything like that, and are regionally consistent. So they have to be basically downloadable and accessible for our entire study area. So everywhere from Nia Bay to Olympia to you know, the Canadian border to the north. And so, you know, the data, like the groundwater data set from USGS satisfies that criteria. As of right now, we only have Cosmos results for Whatcom County publicly available. So that does not satisfy that criteria. However, the choice to go with this off-the-shelf inundation layer approach that Avery described, in which we went from phase 1, in which we constructed our own inundation layers. I should say Avery constructed our own inundation layers painfully and manually, to this approach that we've designed for this phase of using NOAA's pre-built inundation layers that are available for download online. That was designed around the idea that in the future we would be able to incorporate layers that are produced through Cosmos. And that has the benefit additionally of capturing some of these dynamic flooding processes associated with things like fluvial flow and associated with wave run-up, for example, that Jessica brought up, into the analysis in a way that's more rigorous than certainly what we're doing now. So you know, the idea is we hopefully have created a framework that can be updated when those kind of results are available for the entire region. Okay, let's see. So Brittany asked, oh, Brittany, thank you for teeing up that question. I'm going to save that one. So Brittany's question was, how could planners use this data for policies or planning on the shoreline? So that's actually a question I want to pose to the group. So hold that thought. And Lau asked, to what extent might future coastal flooding in Puget Sound also be influenced by changes in flashy river conditions and flooding? So those are not currently integrated into what we're doing. There are projections for fluvial flow in Puget Sound, and those are actually being integrated into this Cosmos project that's been referenced. That is a USGS coastal storm modeling system that is in development currently for all of Puget Sound. Results are available for Whatcom County. We expect that results for King and Pierce are going to be available this year. That's supported by EPA, and that does incorporate some of those fluvial flow projections. So where in places near river mouth river mouths where that potentially modifies the coastal flooding exposure. We will then, once we sort of get those results and can integrate them into frameworks like this, then we will have that sort of insight.
And then,
Probably time
Jessica
for,
asked for if the data set is publicly available to
I'm
poke
also going to
around
get to that.
now.
Yep.
Okay.
So save that thought, Jessica.
And then Wesley is curious how we see these potentially interacting with other factors such as insurance and the potential to advocate for managed retreat, which got a couple likes.
Yeah. So, and maybe that's, well, I'll address that one. We, as part of this project, have been asked by the Habitat Strategic Initiative to sort of think through policy implications for results like this. And, I think that our conclusion was that there definitely are policy implications potentially, as, basically science nerds mostly sort of working on this. We don't have fantastic insight about what those may be, but it is worth noting that, we are definitely not the first to do this kind of parcel scale sort of assessment. Flood factor is one that came out just as we were starting our first phase, which is a nationwide parcel scale sort of flood analysis, and did not seem to generate a lot of response from a policy standpoint or from an insurance standpoint. So our expectation is that that's not our audience for this analysis, I guess is the best way to put it. Our audience for this analysis is primarily with people working in Puget Sound on the landscape, restoration practitioners, potentially hazard planners, potentially land use planners, although that's something that I wanted to ask this group about applications there. Those kinds of audiences are who we're primarily focused on. And then applications for policy initiatives associated with things like managed retreat, for example, it's not specifically designed for that, but it is designed to identify those places that are likely to be impacted first and most essentially as sea level rises in Puget Sound. And one of the policy options that can be applied there is managed retreat. It doesn't, there's nothing about this analysis that prescribes or sort of leads one to the management options. That is sort of comes next in the process.
Shall we move
I am
on?
going to, let's move on, since I think a lot of the questions are starting to move into these broader questions. But I would note that if there are any questions about the spatial analysis or the sort of modeling, hit them in the chat and Avery can respond to those. So let's go ahead. There's only 2 more slides, and I just really wanted to highlight 2 additional things, and then we'll get back to taking on some of these questions. So this is the second phase of this project. We are currently in the middle of it. And this phase, so Avery described sort of some of the work associated with our first objective, which is to update basically the spatial analysis and the resulting spatial data that we're producing. There are 2 other big goals associated with this second phase. One is to validate the results, so come up with some way to basically try to understand how well this spatial data approach reflects actual vulnerability on the ground. And so that means that we are looking for basically other options for assessing vulnerability that we can use to compare to our results. And then the second thing is that this project has a major emphasis, unlike our first phase, on communication of those results. So we have a significant part of the overall project budget, the investment, is associated with developing a, probably an online interactive portal that would be designed to allow users to focus in on particular areas, change weightings associated with particular elements of the analysis, and potentially export information suitable for particular areas of interest those sorts of things. So that's expected by project end, which is currently set at summer 2027. It is worth noting that we do expect that the spatial data results will be available sooner than that, although exactly when is not something that I can sort of say with certainty at this point. But that communication of results is certainly a key goal. So let's go to the last slide, because this is where there's a couple things here. One, thank you for taking your time today. Again, both my and Avery's contact information are on the screen here, as well as, again, an acknowledgement to our funding for this, supporting this project. The QR code here will take you to our Phase 1 project page, which is hosted by the Washington Coastal Resilience Network. So that's on the Resilience Network website. That project page has the technical documentation associated with Phase 1, as well as a link to download the geodatabase we generated for Phase 1. So that is kind of the best we can do currently in terms of being able to sort of interrogate the results. And it's available as a geodatabase download. So it does require sort of like pulling it into your GIS to really be able to work with. And on the screen, I've also posed kind of 4 things that we're really looking for help with from people like you. And so I want to run through those quickly so that we can focus in on the last one, which is, I think, our sort of most pressing question for the time we have remaining today. But basically, this idea of validation, one of the things that we are hoping to do is come back to this group, the Shoreline and Coastal Planners group, hopefully as soon as this upcoming fall, with some kind of workshop, some other sort of engagement that we can do. And we're basically interested whether you're willing to share information about places you see as vulnerable. One of the ways that we want to approach this validation problem is to ask people like you that know the landscape well, and that know places that sort of you view as vulnerable for whatever reason. And if we can sort of collect enough of those, we can compare them to our results and sort of get a sense for how well we're capturing people's experts' perceptions of vulnerability on the landscape. So keep that question in mind. Are you willing to share information? Look for opportunities through the Shoreline Coastal Planners Group for engaging on that question, again, hopefully as soon as this fall. The second thing is, do you have thoughts, this communication problem? Do you have thoughts on what a portal should look like? What should that be like? One of the things that I'm just starting now to start to put together, we have an advisory group for this project that's currently focused on the spatial data analysis. I anticipate putting together another one, or maybe evolving the one we currently have, to focus more on communication as we get into that phase of the project, really with this idea of what should a portal look like. So if you're interested in that particular thing, please reach out to me via email so I can just add your name to a list of potential candidates for that advisory role. The advisory group for this project, generally it commits about maybe an hour or 2 a month, on average, usually responding to sort of questions or information via email. And that's probably how the communications advisory group would work as well. The third thing is, we would love for you to stay connected to this project. The best way to do that is probably what you're already doing, which is you're part of the Shoreline and Coastal Planners group listserv, and we anticipate being able to provide project updates when things become available via that listserv. And then finally, one of the key questions I have for you all right now, especially those of you that are really sort of centered in the land use planning world, is are there particular applications, especially given how climate planning is changing within land use realms in Washington currently because of the legislature and HB 1181? Could you see using this for land use planning, and how? That's an application that we've sort of touched on had a few conversations about, but really need to dive deeply into to really understand the potential use cases and any configuration of how we're doing this to really sort of configure it for that use. So would love to sort of hear about that. I think that in the moments that we have remaining, we're either going to stick with the chat or we might even have a chance to do raising of hands. I'm not totally sure, and sort of actually hearing people's voices. I'll leave that up to Sydney. But in the meantime, we can address other questions in the chat.
Yeah, so Brittany kind of touched on this in the chat of how could planners use this data for policies or planning on shoreline. And she wrote, for example, our city will be developing a master shoreline plan, and she's wondering how to integrate this data into the plan. So that's one way, is potentially developing the shoreline master plan around this data.
Yeah, and then Wesley just said the integration of setbacks
Mm-hmm.
for vulnerability is super helpful. So that's cool to hear. We were excited to be able to do that in this second phase.
Yeah, we invite folks to put their comments in the chat. I'm going to unspotlight Avery and Ian so that we can all see each other. And then, yeah, if you would like to raise your hand and add a comment, we might be able to take a comment or two before we wrap up. Danielle, go ahead, and hopefully you're able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so in terms of validation, as you know, Ian, the port just completed some exposure mapping for sea level rise, and it might be interesting to just compare the exposure maps that you guys are using and the results from our study too. So that might be an option for validation. And then in terms of planning, I think that this could be another resource for us as a port. I'm with the Port of Seattle, to look at prioritizing investments for our properties and think about what near-term adaptation strategies we might need to look at budgeting for.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. And that also, just in reply to that, yeah, the notion of using, so, you know, in Puget Sound across a variety of jurisdictions and tribes, we have a number of jurisdictions, you know, including the Port of Seattle, that have are in the process of or have completed vulnerability assessments. And so one of the other validation approaches that we're going to try is essentially kind of like extracting the lists of vulnerable places from those if they are identified, and using those as another comparison data set. How exactly we're going to do that isn't totally clear yet, because that's potentially a very time-consuming process, but it is definitely on our list to take advantage of all that work that's been done across Puget Sound. It's also worth noting, I wanted to bring this up, you know, oftentimes we get asked, what's the difference between this and all those, you know, tens of vulnerability assessments that have been conducted typically for jurisdictions or tribes within Puget Sound. And, you know, there's a variety of ways to answer that, but one that I did not focus on was that typically those vulnerability, not all of them, but many of them are focused around particular types of assets, right? So a jurisdiction may do it, you know, like the port, for example, may do it focused on port assets. And that's going to be a different list of assets than what we're looking at. So that's one just important difference to recognize. This world of sea level rise vulnerability assessment, or vulnerability assessment in general associated with climate change, is obviously far reaching. And so there's a sort of a lot of work that we need to do to get sort of a full picture of our vulnerability across the landscape, across different responsibilities of different jurisdictions. And so this is one piece of that.
Thanks, Ian. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up just so we can get folks out of here on time. Rebecca's going to switch over to share a few slides. So just hang on, everyone, one more second while we wrap up. So thank you, everyone, for attending this planners briefing. After this concludes later this afternoon, you're going to get an email with a survey link to share some feedback. We really value your feedback in improving our Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group events. That will also have some information about getting AICP credits if that's something you're interested in. Next slide, Rebecca. As we mentioned earlier, we do have credits on offer. This will be provided in the follow-up email. And if you need proof of attendance, like a proof of attendance certificate, please reach out to me directly. Again, this will be in the email so we can get you what you need. Next. Later today, hopefully, we will be able to share a recording of this session and also the slide deck. It'll be posted on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website. And next. We just want to say thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Ian and Avery, for sharing this great information. Thank you, everyone in the chat who participated and communicated with one another and asked some really great questions. This has been a presentation of the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group, co-hosted by Department of Ecology and Washington Sea Grant. If you have any questions or comments about Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group events, please reach out to myself or Rebecca. And we'll just say thank you so much for attending. A follow-up email will be coming soon. We'll hang on for a few minutes if you have any follow-up or logistical questions, and we look forward to seeing you at future SCPG events. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy this beautiful sunny weekend. Get out there and do something nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.